Nikki Bhati's dreams ended in silence. Arjun Vairya's greed consumed everything. Meera Vairya's control turned deadly, and Inspector Karan Devraj's pursuit of the truth exposed the shocking reality behind Greater Noida's most disturbing dowry case. Nikki Bhati's wedding was remembered in Greater Noida as one of the grandest events of that summer. The Bhati family poured every ounce of their savings into making the day perfect, determined to meet the endless expectations set by their daughter's in-laws. Glittering lights adorned the hall, tables overflowed with rich dishes, and guests whispered about the lavish arrangements. To the crowd, it seemed like a celebration of love and prosperity. For Nikki's parents, however, it was a heavy burden disguised as happiness. They had borrowed money, sold ancestral land, and drained resources just to satisfy the list of demands that had been presented before the wedding. Nikki, dressed in a red bridal lehenga that shimmered under the lights, smiled shyly at the cameras, but the weight of those expectations was already pressing on her shoulders. She was 23 years old, bright, educated, and filled with ambition. She dreamed of starting a career in interior design, of working in studios and showcasing her creativity. But her marriage to Arjun Vairya meant stepping into a household where dreams were secondary, and appearances mattered more than anything else. Arjun was admired by many for his charm and his air of success. To outsiders, he appeared as the perfect groom, ambitious, modern, and confident. But behind his polished image, he carried a hunger for wealth that was never satisfied. His family, especially his mother, Meera Vairya, measured worth in terms of gold, cars, and bank accounts. The Bhatis had already given more than they could afford, but whispers had begun even before the wedding night that the gifts were not enough. After the festivities ended, Nikki moved into the Vairya household, a sprawling two-story house that looked welcoming from the outside. The neighbors described it as one of the most respected homes on the street, but the warmth of its walls was only an illusion. From her first morning there, Nikki sensed an unspoken tension. Meera's smile was thin, her gaze sharp, and her questions carefully laced with judgment. Arjun was polite but distant, offering no comfort as Nikki adjusted to her new surroundings. At first, the cracks were almost invisible. There were comments about the car Nikki's parents had provided, about how it was not the model they had hoped for. There were suggestions that more jewelry should have been included in the truce. Nikki brushed them aside, convincing herself that every family had its challenges and that she could win them over with patience and kindness. She believed marriage required compromise and effort, and she was determined to make it work. The Bhati family continued to visit occasionally, each time sensing that something was not entirely right. Nikki's elder sister Sanjana tried to ask her if she was truly happy, but Nikki only offered a reassuring smile and told her not to worry. She did not want to add to her parents' burdens, not after they had sacrificed so much for her marriage. The truth remained locked inside her heart, hidden behind the polite facade she wore for the world. Despite the glittering photographs that circulated among relatives and on social media, Nikki felt isolated. The once vibrant young woman who loved designing, who sketched patterns late into the night, now found her days consumed by household chores and the cold silence of her husband. Arjun's attention was no longer on her, but on what her family could provide. He spent his evenings calculating expenses, planning new investments, and hinting at the money he expected to come from the Bhatis. Nikki's social media posts from those early weeks told a different story. Smiling selfies, cheerful captions, and photos of decorated meals gave the impression of a woman enjoying her new life. But those who looked carefully would notice her eyes did not match her smile. There was a distance, a quiet plea for something beyond the glittering surface. As the days turned into months, Nikki realized she was living in a house built on transactions, not love. The fairy tale that others believed in was slowly unraveling, and only she could see the truth beneath the decorated surface. What had begun as a grand wedding, filled with laughter and light, was already shifting into a story marked by silence, control, and demands that would never end. The world saw a perfect marriage, but Nikki knew she had stepped into something far darker. And though she stayed silent, her story had already begun to move toward an ending that no one at her wedding could have imagined. Within only a few months of her marriage, Nikki Bhati began to feel the slow unraveling of her new life. What had once seemed like small complaints or subtle remarks grew sharper, heavier, and more deliberate. The car her parents had gifted, once spoken of with grudging acceptance, became a frequent point of taunt. The gold sets that had glittered at her wedding were suddenly described as insufficient. It became clear that the Vairya family had not only expected more but felt entitled to it, and every interaction seemed to revolve around what was lacking rather than what had been given. Arjun Vairya's ambitions began to overshadow every corner of their relationship. He had big dreams of expanding his business, but instead of focusing on hard work, he found it easier to press his new wife into extracting money from her family. He would grow cold whenever Nikki spoke of her aspirations to work. He dismissed her degree as irrelevant, insisting her responsibility was to fulfill the needs of his household. At first, Nikki attempted to reason gently, to explain that her parents had already given beyond their capacity, but her words were swallowed by silence or anger. Her mother-in-law, Meera Vairya, added to the suffocation. She had built her entire sense of identity around control, and Nikki quickly became the target of her sharp tongue. Any small misstep, whether a meal not prepared to her liking or a task done differently, became an excuse for scolding. Yet behind the scolding lingered the constant undertone of dissatisfaction with the dowry. It was less about Nikki's actions and more about what her family had failed to provide. Neighbors began to notice that the once lively bride seemed to be shrinking into herself. Where she had once waved from the balcony with a smile, she now stood there quietly, staring into the street below as though searching for escape. Her laughter, which had once echoed in the Bhati household, was absent from the Vairya home. She attended family gatherings with a polite smile, but relatives whispered that she seemed pale, her expressions forced. Sanjana, her elder sister, sensed the change most strongly. Their phone conversations, once filled with playful banter, had become short and subdued. Nikki's voice often sounded tired, as though she was holding something back. When Sanjana asked directly if everything was fine, Nikki would reassure her quickly, changing the subject before her emotions slipped through. Deep down, Sanjana feared her sister was suffering in silence, but without proof, she could do little more than worry. Arjun's behavior grew more volatile over time. On days when business went poorly, he returned home with a bitterness that he unleashed on Nikki. Though he rarely raised his hand, his words carried the same weight as blows. He accused her of being a burden, of failing to bring the wealth he had been promised. When she suggested seeking work, his response was a firm rejection. Her role, he reminded her, was not to earn but to deliver. The strain showed in subtle details. Nikki's diary, later recovered, contained entries filled with fragmented thoughts, phrases about feeling trapped, about wanting to breathe, about the silence that followed her wherever she went. She wrote of nights where she cried quietly into her pillow, afraid that even her sobs would invite criticism. She wrote about meals where every bite tasted like judgment, about mornings where hope felt too heavy to carry. The larger world, however, remained blind. To friends and extended relatives, the marriage still appeared intact. Nikki still posted the occasional cheerful picture on social media, still appeared at family functions in bright clothing, still played her role as the smiling bride. But behind every image was a layer of exhaustion, a mask she wore to protect her parents from the pain she endured. Even the neighborhood began to notice unusual patterns. The sounds of raised voices late at night carried into nearby homes. Once, broken glass was spotted in the backyard, a silent testimony to arguments that had gone too far. But no one interfered, dismissing it as the normal struggles of married life. As weeks turned into months, Nikki's isolation deepened. She no longer found joy in sketching designs or dreaming about her career. Her ambitions had faded into shadows, replaced by the daily task of survival. She moved through the house like a ghost, cautious with every step, careful with every word. Her silence became her armor, but it was also her cage. From the outside, the Vairya household continued to project respectability and success. Guests still came and went, neighbors still greeted them politely, and Arjun still carried himself as the confident young businessman. Yet within those walls, Nikki's spirit was quietly eroding. The cracks that had once been invisible had now widened into fault lines, and though no one outside fully realized it yet, her story was heading toward a breaking point that could not remain hidden for the night that would forever alter the Bhati and Vairya families. Began with tension that had been simmering for days. The monsoon rains had swept through Greater Noida, leaving the streets damp and the sky heavy with thunder. Inside the Vairya home, the storm was far greater than anything outside. Nikki had once again refused to call her parents for money, and Arjun's frustration had boiled into open fury. Their voices carried through the closed windows, a harsh rhythm of anger that unsettled even the neighbors accustomed to occasional arguments from the house. Later, when silence fell, it was not the peace of reconciliation, but the silence of something far darker. By the time the night ended, Nikki was found unconscious in her bedroom. The call to the hospital was delayed, and when she finally arrived, doctors could only declare her dead. The explanation given was simple and convenient. She had taken her own life, unable to bear the pressures of married life. But from the beginning, the details did not add up. Her body had been discovered in a position inconsistent with hanging, and there were bruises visible even to the untrained eye. The neighbors had heard shouting earlier that evening, followed by a sudden quiet that felt unnatural. Even more suspiciously, her phone was wiped clean of messages and call logs, as though someone had carefully erased her digital footprint before help was summoned. When the news reached the Bhati family, grief mixed instantly with suspicion. Sanjana, Nikki's elder sister, was certain her sibling would never have chosen to end her life. Nikki had been strong-willed even in her silence, and though she had endured torment, Sanjana knew her sister too well to believe the story of a fragile bride who had broken under pressure. For her parents, the pain was unbearable, but beneath their mourning was the gnawing belief that something far more sinister had occurred behind the closed doors of the Vairya household. The case quickly drew the attention of local authorities. Inspector Karan Devraj, a man known for his sharp instincts and refusal to accept easy answers, was assigned to investigate. From his first visit to the house, he sensed a performance being staged. The Vairyas insisted on their narrative, repeating that Nikki had been unable to adjust to married life. They pointed to her quiet nature, portraying it as evidence of depression. But to the inspector, the overly practiced words rang hollow. Forensic examination began to unravel the story further. The autopsy revealed not only marks around her neck but also bruises on her arms and wrists, signs of a struggle that clashed with the idea of a voluntary act. Broken bangles were found near the bed, as though in her final moments, Nikki had fought against something or someone. Meanwhile, whispers spread across the neighborhood. Some claimed they had heard loud crashes from inside the Vairya house that night. Others remembered seeing Arjun leave the house in a hurry only to return minutes later, his expression grim and unsettled. Few were willing to speak openly at first, but the unease in the community was undeniable. Inspector Devraj's investigation grew more focused. He discovered that Nikki had kept a hidden email account, one her husband and in-laws knew nothing about. Through it, she had occasionally sent messages to herself, documenting her feelings of being trapped and afraid. In one of her final entries, she wrote about being unable to breathe in that house, about a night where she feared something terrible was about to happen. The contrast between the outward image of a successful family and the reality inside their walls became sharper with every piece of evidence. The Vairyas had carefully crafted their statement of suicide, but the inconsistencies were too many to ignore. The timing of the hospital call, the condition of the room, the erasure of phone data, all pointed toward deliberate interference rather than despair. As the investigation deepened, suspicion hardened into certainty for Nikki's family. To them, her death was not the story of a woman who could not endure life, but of a woman who had been silenced when she refused to bend further to the demands of greed. The night of silence was no accident. It was the result of rage, control, and betrayal. By the end of that week, Greater Noida was buzzing with rumors. People spoke in hushed voices about dowry, about domestic cruelty, and about the dangerous illusion of wealth and respectability. Nikki's funeral became not just a moment of mourning, but also the quiet beginning of a battle for truth. While her body was laid to rest, the unanswered questions surrounding her final night ensured her story was far from over. And though the Vairya family tried to maintain their facade, cracks had already begun to appear, cracks through which the hidden truth would eventually be exposed. The investigation into Nikki Bhati's death grew heavier with each passing day, and the facade carefully held by the Vairya family began to crumble under scrutiny. Inspector Karan Devraj, meticulous in his methods, refused to be satisfied with vague explanations. His team revisited the Vairya home multiple times, searching for anything that had been overlooked. It was during one such visit that a small but crucial discovery was made: a torn piece of paper hidden beneath the wardrobe, scribbled with a half-written sentence in Nikki's handwriting. It spoke of suffocation and fear, cut off as though interrupted mid-thought. This fragment became the first undeniable trace that Nikki had attempted to leave behind her truth. In the following weeks, the autopsy reports returned with details that strengthened the suspicion of foul play. There were deep bruises on Nikki's arms, and faint marks along her wrists, suggesting she had been restrained or held down. A thin cut was found near her temple, the kind unlikely to come from self-harm, but consistent with blunt force. The findings conflicted with the narrative of suicide, turning the spotlight firmly on the Vairya family. Parallel to the forensic revelations, another thread of truth emerged through a person who had been quietly holding on to evidence. Rohit Malhan, Nikki's childhood friend, stepped forward. His name had not surfaced in the case until then, but his testimony added an entirely new dimension to the story. He revealed that Nikki had been confiding in him for months, often reaching out late at night when her fear was at its peak. She had sent him detailed accounts of the harassment she endured, of the relentless pressure for money, and of Arjun's violent temper. Rohit provided chat transcripts and emails, each one a window into the hidden torment Nikki had faced. The most chilling of these messages described threats she had received from both Arjun and his mother. Nikki wrote about being told she would be sent back in shame if her family did not deliver more money, and about the growing isolation she felt in a house where no one offered her compassion. These messages were time-stamped only days before her death, painting a haunting picture of her final weeks. The investigation into Arjun's finances further darkened the case. Bank statements showed suspicious transactions, with large sums of money moving between his accounts and those of unknown contacts. Records linked him to land dealings that were dubious at best, and investigators suspected he had been relying on dowry money to fuel his venture. The discovery of this financial strain offered a motive more compelling than anything else. The greed that consumed him had turned into desperation, and Nikki had become the obstacle in his way. Witness accounts also started surfacing. A neighbor confessed that she had seen Meera Vairya visiting a local jeweler only days after Nikki's death, attempting to sell gold ornaments that matched pieces known to have belonged to Nikki. Another neighbor recalled seeing Nikki with bruises on her arm weeks earlier, though she had dismissed it at the time as an accident. These scattered testimonies began to form a grim mosaic of abuse, exploitation, and betrayal. The case against the Vairya family strengthened to the point where their initial story no longer held weight. The narrative of suicide collapsed under the evidence of physical assault, erased phone data, suspicious financial dealings, and first-hand accounts of harassment. What had once been presented as a tragedy of weakness was now being revealed as a crime of cruelty. For Nikki's sister Sanjana, these revelations were both devastating and vindicating. She had always believed her sister's silence hid a much darker truth, and now the pieces were aligning to confirm her suspicions. Every discovery added to the anguish of knowing Nikki had lived her last days in fear, but it also steeled her determination to see justice done. By the time the investigation reached this stage, public attention had surged. The story was no longer just about one woman's death,
but about the widespread plague of dowry harassment and the dangers hidden behind closed doors. The case was discussed in living rooms, debated in media, and whispered about in every corner of Greater Noida. Nikki's name had become a symbol of both tragedy and resilience, her unfinished words echoing far beyond the walls of the home where she had once been silent. As the truth continued to unravel, it was clear that the Vairya family's carefully constructed mask of respectability could no longer protect them. Each new revelation pushed them closer to exposure, and the weight of their secrets began to crush the life they had once so carefully crafted. What had started as whispers of suspicion had transformed into a storm of undeniable evidence, and that storm was about to sweep them into the courtroom, where their fate would finally be decided. The final phase of the investigation brought every hidden thread together, weaving a story of greed, cruelty and betrayal that could no longer be concealed. Inspector Karan Devraj compiled the evidence into a timeline that left little room for doubt. The night of Nikki's death had not been the quiet despair of a woman taking her own life, but the violent end of someone who had resisted until her final breath. First forensic results revealed broken bangles scattered on the floor, strands of hair clenched in her fist, and traces of blood beneath her fingernails, proof that she had fought against her attackers. The staged scene of suicide collapsed under the weight of these details. The courtroom became the arena where Nikki's story was finally told in full. The Bhati family sat through each session with grief carved into their faces, while the Vairyas tried desperately to maintain their crumbling facade. Prosecutors presented the autopsy findings, the erased phone data, the torn diary page, and the testimonies of neighbors who had heard her final cries. Rohit Malhan's evidence became the most powerful blow against the defense. His collection of emails and chat transcripts, read aloud in court, painted the harrowing reality of Nikki's last months. Each word written by her became her voice beyond the grave, piercing through the lies woven by those who wanted her story buried. Arjun's financial dealings were exposed in detail, showing not only his recklessness, but also his growing dependence on dowry demands to sustain his ambitions. The records revealed his desperation transactions, pointing to risky land deals that had drained his resources. When Nikki refused to pressure her parents for more, his frustration had escalated into violence. Meera Vairya's role was revealed through the testimony of neighbors, and a jeweler who confirmed her attempt to sell ornaments shortly after Nikki's death. The prosecution argued that she was not just complicit but active in the harassment and cover-up. The defense tried to portray Nikki as fragile, claiming she had been emotionally unstable. They attempted to dismiss her messages to Rohit as exaggerations and framed her as a woman unable to adjust to married life. But these claims unraveled quickly under the weight of physical evidence. The injuries on her body were impossible to explain away, and the erasure of her phone records pointed directly to deliberate tampering. The judge listened as layers of deception were stripped away, leaving behind a chilling reality of premeditated cruelty disguised as domestic life. For the community, the case became more than just one family's tragedy. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, journalists reported every new detail, and debates erupted about dowry harassment and the silence it imposes on women. Nikki's story resonated because it echoed the fears of countless others living in similar cages. She had been one among many, but her courage to document her pain turned her into a symbol that could not be ignored. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom held its breath. Arjun Vairya and Meera Vairya were found guilty of dowry harassment and murder, sentenced to life imprisonment. The words of the judgment cut through the silence, declaring that greed and cruelty had extinguished a young life full of promise. As the sentence was read, Arjun sat motionless, his ambition reduced to nothing, while Meera's expression hardened, the mask of authority stripped away. For Nikki's family, the verdict brought no joy, only a measure of justice. Sanjana wept as she left the courtroom, clutching her sister's photograph. Their parents, broken by loss, found some solace in knowing the truth had not been buried under lies. Nikki's hidden words, her last attempts to reach beyond her isolation, had ensured that her story was heard. In Greater Noida, her name lingered in conversations long after the trial ended. Streets that once whispered about her wedding now spoke of her final email, discovered in her secret account, carried a haunting message that echoed everywhere. If anything happens to me, know that I never gave up. I was made to disappear. Those words became her legacy, a reminder that silence can hide pain but cannot erase the truth. The Vairya home, once a place of respect and admiration, now stood as a grim reminder of what unfolded inside its walls. Neighbors passed by quietly, recalling the smiling bride they had once seen on the balcony. The glittering wedding that had begun Nikki's story was now remembered as the first act of a tragedy, but within that tragedy lay a powerful truth, the resilience of one young woman's voice, carried forward even after her death, strong enough to bring justice against those who tried to erase